Okay, great. You should see it.
Got it. Okay, give me a sec. Or a minute. Jeff, as soon as you hear Mozart,
Okay.
assume the mic is live. You don't hear Mozart. It means he's probably drunk somewhere. That's not, is that Mozart? Well, it's not piano.
Yeah, that's Luciano.
What is it?
It says Mozart, but I think that's Luciano.
Okay. Just when I announce it at the end of the show, I don't want to say the name of the wrong classical composer.
Oh, don't worry. I'm trying to get the right one for you.
Okay, I'm sharing this to a bunch of sites now. We are there, sir. We are there.
Okay, hold tight.
Let me get the volume right. Hang on. We're all shared. Hang on. Good. Okay. Whenever you're ready. Oh, we're 2 minutes ahead. Good for us.
Yep. Okay.
We could be running the railroad.
Exactly.
Mozart is banging that piano. Playing it hard like he's mad.
And take it, Greg.
Welcome.
You go ahead and take a sip.
On Monday tonight. And Ruben caught me right in the middle of a sip of water when he told me it's time to go on, but that's okay because you're listening to the 244th installment of the Age Out Angels Radio Hour right here on www.hamiltonradio.net Channel 2. I'm your host, Greg Rapport. If you're new to the show, I'm the founder and executive director of Age Out Angels. We provide one-to-one mentors to vulnerable youth for the purpose of coordinating the care and services that they need to thrive. We try to help young people avoid some of the horrible pitfalls that they're likely to face when they don't have a proper safety net. And this program is brought to you every week at the same time, courtesy of the fine people here at Hamilton Radio who allow us to use this airtime. Ruben is on the big board tonight. Robin is producing. So good to have both of you in this new year, our first show of the new year. And so good to have all of you listening at home from your computers, in your cars in New Jersey and around the country. Now, please take a moment. If you're looking at us on Facebook or YouTube, hit all the buttons for me. We need you to like and subscribe and share because this is relevant to everyone in your world. The main topic of tonight, child abuse, is something that affects everyone, everywhere. And one thing, I always promise you the same thing. You're not going to hear this on the nightly news tonight. The only place you're going to hear it is here. So please, we need you to get out there and help us share this and spread the word and help us be part of the solution, okay? Tonight, we're going to focus on child abuse, and it's not going to be pretty, I'm sure. Hopefully, we have a fabulous guest who will offer our solutions. But before we get to that, I just wanted to tell you guys about one thing, because something that I want to go over sort of as the weeks progress in this new year is asking the question, where's the money? Where does the money go? So we sort of started to look at where the money goes. And I don't know if you guys know this or not, but the Biden administration apparently proposed an increase of over $20 billion in the year 2024 in the new budget, which I don't believe has yet been actually approved, but they were going from something like 70 to 90 million dollars a year going to this budget. And this is information from the Child Welfare League. He actually proposed this in March. Increases in the human services areas of the budget and in medical services. The Administration for Children and Families, that's sort of who gets the money as part of the Department of Health and Human Services, covers a range of human services programs, including all of the child welfare programs. In 2024, the administration budget seeks $94.4 billion. I'm sorry, did I say million before? For ACF, which is the Administration for Children and Families, an increase from the 2023 total of $71 billion. Much of that increase, that's like $23 billion increase, much of the increase to support the Family First Prevention Services Act, which according to the stats is showing a bit of promise in early results. It's way too early to know, but still, it's not like it's looking bad in terms of reduction of youth in group homes and reduction of youth in institutions, which was supposedly, its original intention. Other items in the 23 budget that will indirectly influence family and children's services, and by extension, child welfare, are things like a proposed expansion of the early childhood education budget. A lot of stats talking about how early childhood education makes a big difference. So in the weeks to come, we're going to be talking about sort of where that money goes and how it gets spent, and maybe how some of it gets where it's supposed to go. And so we have that to look forward to, and I hope you will enjoy that with us. Now, tonight, my guest is a gentleman named Jeff DION. He is an attorney, a survivor, and a nationally recognized victims advocate. Jeff, welcome to the Age Out Angels Radio Hour.
Thanks, Greg. It's good to be with you.
It's great to have you here. Now, you are the CEO of an organization called the Zero Abuse Project.
That's right.
And so can you tell us a little bit about what the Zero Abuse Project is and what its mission is and how it works?
Sure. Zero Abuse Project is a nonprofit that's dedicated to eliminating all forms of child abuse and child sexual assault. And we attack the problem from a number of different angles. And we use a method of education, training, prevention, and response to try and keep kids safe. And our director of research and education is a guy by the name of Victor Veith. And in the early 90s, Victor was a young prosecutor working in Minnesota in a rural community. And one of his jobs was to prosecute child abuse cases. And he had a case that didn't go well. And he walked away from there knowing that, nobody in that courtroom really knew what they were doing. In terms of child abuse. He didn't, the judge didn't, the defense attorney didn't. And he knew that if they were going to be successful, they really needed to get everybody to work together, law enforcement, social workers, the justice system, for everybody to be on the same page and make that work. And then as they adopted that approach, they started to be much more successful. And the next time state statistics came out, they found that that little county had the highest rate of convictions for child abuse than any place else in the state of Minnesota. And at first, some of the local politicians were like, that's terrible. And they told them, no, that's really good. It doesn't mean you have more of a problem. It means you're doing a better job at combating it. And so then Victor went on to work for the National District Attorneys Association, training other prosecutors on how to prosecute these cases effectively, and eventually formed an organization known as the National Child Protection Training Center, which really brought together multidisciplinary teams. And we know that this works best when law enforcement, child protection professionals, and prosecutors all work together on behalf of kids. And so now Victor is part of Zero Abuse Project, and we help train prosecutors, we train law enforcement, we train victim advocates so that everybody can work together to combat this. Because we know one of the reasons we believe that we can eliminate child abuse in this country in 3 generations. And if you look at each generation as about 40 years, that means it would take about 120 years. So it's not going to be in our lifetime, but there's work that we can do to make sure we get there. And because the biggest problems, the obstacles that stand in the way of ending child abuse is that, one, most kids don't disclose. And if cases aren't reported, nobody can do anything about it. So we need to make sure that people are on the lookout for signs when kids do make a disclosure, that they're taken seriously, that the right people get the information and an appropriate report can be made. The other problem is, even if a report is made, oftentimes it's not investigated, and the people who are doing it aren't properly trained. So we need to make sure that all of those people have appropriate training. And so we look at attacking this from a number of different angles. We've got programs that are in colleges and universities training the child protection workers before they even get in the field. We've got training for law enforcement and prosecutors on how to effectively do these cases in a trauma-informed way. And we also have resources for survivors to help them navigate their lives and deal with the ramifications and impact of child abuse, and so that we can break that cycle.
So you are trying to create, I guess what I'm hearing is the single most thorough collaboration of stakeholders, we'll call it.
Absolutely, because we believe that everyone has a role to play in keeping kids safe. And sometimes people just don't know what it is that they can do. And so it's really about helping to coordinate everybody and make sure everybody knows their role and what they can do so that we can tackle this problem.
Right. So if we follow the sort of the timeline of something like this, it would start with a child reporting, or or a concerned adult noticing something.
That's right. And one of the things that we do, we also focus a lot, as I said, on prevention. We've got a prevention education curriculum called Empower Me that's used in throughout Minnesota and in Maryland and Arkansas. And this prevention education curriculum teaches kids about how to have 5 trusted adults in their life that they can tell anything to, about what to do with that feeling in your stomach, and when people do things that make you feel uncomfortable, and when sometimes talking about these issues with kids will prompt a child to make a disclosure and say, "Oh, you mean like when my uncle did this to me?" And so we need to make sure that schools are prepared to appropriately respond to that. And so it might start with bringing up the conversation as part of an educational curriculum, and then making sure that whoever hears that and is going to be a mandated reporter is going to make an appropriate report. And then once they do, Child Protective Services would come in and conduct an investigation. And hopefully the person who is doing that investigation had been through our Child Advocacy Studies program, which is in 95 colleges and universities around the country, so that they would be well prepared to, one, be able to identify the signs of complex child abuse, and make a good report, that if the allegations are founded, turn it over to law enforcement. Then that child would be brought to a child advocacy center where they would have an interview with a forensic interviewer. Prosecutors have a really tough job, and they've got to prove their case beyond a reasonable doubt. And sometimes a prosecutor would look at a child abuse case, and especially if it's child sex abuse, where there's not a lot of physical evidence, like if a child's been beaten, or has a broken arm, and without that physical evidence, it can be a really tough case. And what the prosecutor says is, well, I've got the victim's word versus the defendant's word, and that doesn't get me beyond a reasonable doubt. What do I do with this? But we know that an effective forensic interview will yield between 20 and 40 pieces of corroborating evidence that can help make the prosecutor's case. And our forensic interview training program, called Child First, has been adopted by 24 different states, and it's the leading program in the country to do that. And when I was just talking with a prosecutor who said when they started being able to introduce the forensic interview into evidence in court, it had a tremendous impact on being able to get convictions. And so it's really transformed the way they do cases. But prosecutors need to know how to use that forensic interview, how to get it into evidence, and how to work together with law enforcement and victim advocates to be successful. Being a part of a criminal case can be really traumatic for a child, and we want to do everything we can to try and reduce that trauma and make it easier for kids. And then if someone is being criminally prosecuted, oftentimes that's going to make the news. And what do we see? Once it makes the news, other survivors start to come out of the woodwork and say, hey, they did that to me too. And so then more people come forward, and maybe they're still within their criminal or civil statute of limitations. Maybe they're not. But either way, we have resources available through our Survivor Space website that helps give survivors the tools to navigate that and figure out what their options are. And so at so many different points in the timeline of a case of abuse, we have support and resources to help make that effective. So people who are trying to do the right thing know they're not in this alone.
It is just the extensive nature of this is just absolutely positively remarkable. Now, years ago, I used to do a lecture called Leading Without Authority. Okay. So what sounds like to me is that you have all these wonderful organizations that have to interact, right? And if one of them doesn't, the system can break down. You know, you're only as strong as the weakest link in that chain, but they all have to get along because nobody outranks.
And that's an important part of the multidisciplinary team model,
Amazing.
And understanding, how those teams are led and recognizing the importance of the different aspects that everybody brings to the team. And we are fortunate to be. We have a grant from the U.S. Department of Justice, so we are the official training and technical assistance provider for prosecutors on child abuse cases. And so the government looked at the work we did and had confidence enough in our work that they designated us to go out and help train prosecutors and other multidisciplinary teams. And, this can be really tough work, and it's hard to do, and it can really wear on your soul. And so in many places, when you start off as a prosecutor and you're what we call a baby prosecutor, they might start you in traffic court or general district court. And then they put you in juvenile and domestic relations court. And everybody sort of goes through this training process until they get on to the bigger cases. And what we find is with people constantly transitioning through juvenile and domestic relations, where a lot of these cases are tried, sometimes you don't get that expertise. And so if someone has a lot of experience, once they get good at it, they're being promoted on to another area. And so that's why there's a constant need for training and to help people understand the best way to do this.
Yeah, I think it's remarkable. So in the timeline of your tenure there as CEO, or if you were there prior to being CEO, this is an amazing structure. Did this develop? Did it evolve over time, or is this something that at one point somebody said, okay, this is how we have to go, and let's put all these separate buckets, right? Of different types of training. I mean, there's like different expertise and all that stuff that goes along with that. Where did that happen in the timeline of all this?
This happened in probably the early to mid 2000s, and when all of the recognition of the importance of this work started to come together, and we started to be really intentional. And so we've got a Zero Abuse as an organization has only been around since 2018. But some of our programs that are now under our umbrella, where everybody can work together, have been around for 30 years. And so it's really about bringing all the people who are doing the best work together under this one umbrella. And we were founded by an attorney by the name of Jeff Anderson out of St. Paul, Minnesota. And Jeff is a tremendous advocate for children, and he's probably sued the Catholic Church for child sex abuse more than anybody else in the country. And along the way, when he's been successful, and he said, what we're doing isn't enough. We need to do more. And that he put his own money that came from these cases into starting Zero Abuse Project to make sure that we were really doing everything to stop this problem because he'd really like not to have victims to represent in court.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Would I love it if people would put me out of business? It'd be the best thing in the world. I go fishing in Boca and life would be good. But so I mean, clearly you bring a vast amount of knowledge, of just statistical knowledge about this whole process. And when you mentioned early to mid 2000s of the program sort of coming together, that fits the timeline, as I understand it, of the development of the gathering of information, the successful gathering of information and research about this topic, because apparently they got into it in the 80s, maybe in the early 90s, but it took a long time a lot of trial and error for them to sort of
Absolutely.
get it
And
right.
one of the things that was really key that sort of changed how everybody looked at it was a study that came out of Kaiser Permanente in the late 80s, the Adverse Childhood Experiences Study, where they learned that there were real health outcomes as a result of the adverse experiences that kids had earlier in life, whether it was being a victim of abuse or having a parent incarcerated or die or witnessing domestic violence or things like that. And what they found was it didn't matter so much what exactly the child experienced or how bad it was, but just that the more boxes you check of these things that have happened, the greater the chance that later in life these would be manifested in poor health outcomes. So that meant if you look at so many of our societal problems, whether it is, substance abuse or mental health issues, a lot of it relates back to that early childhood trauma. And so we started to recognize if childhood trauma has such a tremendous impact that costs society so much money and causes people so much heartache, throughout the course of their lifespan, then it really becomes a public imperative to identify that and do everything we can to stop it. And so adverse childhood experiences really helped everybody understand how much was truly at stake.
Yes, indeed, it's an issue of public health, and needs to get more air. Maybe we'll get lucky and this will go viral, huh?
That's right. And one of the things, part of our strategic plan is helping to foster an environment where child abuse is recognized as a public health emergency, which would help free up and be able to dedicate even more resources to this problem.
Here's what I think. What I think will rattle people if I can get the word out about it, and you too. You know this as well as I do, the notion that when they catch someone and they convict someone, they get caught and convicted for, one thing or two things or three things. But the reality is, they've offended maybe 80 times or 100 times or 300 times. And maybe that's severe enough to be compelling.
Oh, absolutely.
To a public.
Yeah, you're absolutely right. And that is why we're committed to a fair and transparent justice system, because I believe that for kids to be safe, it requires that there are some people out there that are so bad that they need to be separated from society in order for kids to be safe. But we're not going to have that ability unless we have a criminal justice system that is fair and unbiased and that people trust. And so that's why it's so important. And we train prosecutors, we train law enforcement to, the importance of it's sort of like we need the justice system as a hammer, but we can't misuse it. We've got to protect that hammer because that is so important to be able to protect kids. And but you're absolutely right that oftentimes when someone is convicted, the research shows that they might have hundreds of other victims. And the people that listen to your show and care about your group, All Out Angels, know that, with kids coming out of foster care, sometimes kids are in foster care because they've been abused. Sometimes kids are abused in foster care. And so, so it's really important. So a lot of the kids who are coming out of foster care as young adults, one way or another, are themselves survivors. And we know that they get thrust out of a system at 18 years old. But we know that young brains aren't even done fully maturing or developing then. And for boys, it doesn't happen till 27. And when I deal with a lot of survivors who are young and in their early 20s, and I talk to them and I recognize they're not even done cooking yet. They're not even beginning to recognize the impact of what's happened to them or what it's doing to their life. One of the reasons why there's such a delay in people disclosing, particularly childhood sexual abuse, is that the impact of it can really be a latent injury that doesn't manifest itself until many years into adulthood. All of the things that we know are related to it, whether it's dysfunctional relationships, substance abuse, sex addiction, all of those things. Sometimes people have to go through a couple adult life cycles where X, whatever the problem is, fill in the blank, keeps popping up and disrupting their life. And then finally they say, this keeps being a problem. I got to go see someone about this. And they go get into therapy, and the therapist says, well, I think this is related to the sexual abuse you suffered in childhood. And the survivor says, well, wait a minute. I always knew Uncle Billy did that to me, but I never knew that this stuff happened as a result. And it's where they make that connection. And that's why it's so important, that for young people to be able to have that support and those resources, because often those are the times in their life when they are figuring that out and making those connections. And one of the things that I know and that the research has shown about the trauma that kids suffer is that the longer the secret is held, the worse the damage is. And because that unresolved trauma that no one has talked about, it's happening inside like someone's a pinball machine. But it's not a pinball, it's a wrecking ball of trauma that is sort of wreaking havoc in that person's life. And they might not even realize it, what it's all coming from. I worked with a group of survivors that were all abused by the same high school chemistry teacher over the course of years. And so some were in their early 20s and some were in their early 40s. And the person who had the greatest damages, the things that happened to them maybe weren't, the most severe, but the person whose life messed up the most was the person who was in his early 40s, because he'd gone the longest time without any help. And without any resolution to that trauma. And so we want to foster a culture of disclosure where we can remove the stigma and people are more open to talk about it, and other people are more willing to listen and hear people. Because if we do that, then we can start to address some of the ramifications of abuse and really help build resiliency so that maybe the impact won't be as bad. And so that if a kid's been abused, it's not a life sentence that, the die is cast and now you're going to have all these problems. Kids are pretty resilient. But all they need is a little intervention. So we need people who care, who are willing to listen. And but nobody can do anything about a case until they hear about it. And so that's why we want to encourage people to come forward.
So I guess you're ultimately sort of realistic, I guess, in thinking that like 100% elimination of child sexual abuse is something that's highly unlikely, but to find a path by which people can have their lives back.
That's right. And can we, and even if we can't eliminate it, how do we go ahead and beat down these numbers until they get as close to zero as possible? And sometimes it's about believing people. Sometimes it's about understanding how do we create obstacles that make it harder for abusers to get to kids. Now, the hardest part is that the vast majority of kids and the vast majority of abuse and sexual abuse happens within the home. And it's where people have the most access to kids, and they have it in private. And so, that's really problematic. But even if it's not in the home, it is It is almost certainly going to be someone that the child knows and trusts. It's going to be an authority figure, whether it's a coach or a teacher or a youth leader or a clergy. And what we know is that oftentimes abusers will seek out jobs or volunteer positions that will give them access to kids. And so when we say we advocate policies that promote youth protection, it's not just public policies as in statutes, but also individual in organizational policies for individual churches and camps about what are the policies that they need to have in place to keep kids safe, that adults shouldn't be alone with kids, that teachers shouldn't be able to paper over the windows in their classrooms so that people can't see what's going on inside. Things like that that are really easy, that we can make it harder for adults to isolate kids and make them more vulnerable for abuse.
It wouldn't be horrible if there were some way to have consistent vetting policies.
That's right.
Where that, yeah, I can also, listen, I can see a scenario where it's hard to get that information sometimes. Mm-hmm. Sometimes that information, even when it's negative, is considered to be personal, private, information, and we're not always given access to it as nonprofits.
That's true, but and sometimes nonprofits and schools, even when they have the authority, when they hire someone or bring on a volunteer to do a criminal background check, don't. And because only like 10% of abusers are ever have any involvement with the criminal justice system, if you rely on just a criminal background check, you're going to automatically miss 90% of abusers. So we've got to we check references. We ask people, why did they leave that position? And sometimes to get enough information that, what's the red flag? Sometimes it's about, it's just looking at a case and they said one of the red flags should have been that this person was a teacher, but their start date and their end date were not consistent with the start and beginning of the school year. So what's up with that? Things like that we need to ask those questions.
Absolutely. Absolutely true. And I would amplify that simply by saying you could interview 20 job applicants and your radar is never going to be good enough to just pick out the abuser.
That's right.
They're
because
that good.
That's right. And that's why kids, abusers don't just groom kids. We talk a lot about grooming, right? Yeah. And grooming is a process of boundary violations that happens really gradually to make a kid think this is normal, and they really just sort of trick them into this. But abusers don't just groom kids. They groom parents, they groom entire communities, because when one of them is caught, it's not unusual for people to say, oh, they would never do that. It's always the greatest teacher, the most charismatic, everybody's favorite. And that is by design. And that, they will snow and con lots of people. So if adults are being conned by, what a smooth operator this abuser is, kids shouldn't feel bad that they fell for it.
Yes. I mean, listen, this in the old days, what we'd be talking about, one word against the other would be the child, scared, confused, abused, right?
That's right.
And the adult, absolutely practiced and polished. Mm-hmm. So
well, it just case in point, the Jerry Sandusky case, the first survivor that came forward, was not believed, and someone said, why would you say such a terrible thing about someone who's done so much for you and so much good for this community, right? And the abusers will put themselves on pedestals so that they will be above reproach. And but we know that kid was telling the truth. And when someone started to listen, they dug and they found more and more and more. And it was just a huge scandal.
Yes, yes. Lots of stories about the whole town showing up at court to support the abuser.
That's right.
Abuser guy, especially if the abuser guy happened to be like, in the administration,
Mhm.
in the current political administration locally, right? And suddenly the mayor is showing up to say, this guy, you kidding? He runs a church group. He would
Right.
do anything like that. It's just amazing. So when you're if you go in a classroom now, see, knowing what we know about the stats, just about the stats, and knowing that the more people a child is exposed to in their sphere, the more adults, or even they can also be abused by other children.
Right.
The more adults they're exposed to in their sphere, the greater the statistical probability that they will meet up with an abuser.
That's correct. But then that's, the most important thing is to make sure, because abusers love to isolate kids, and they will, search out kids who are looking for attention, who might be an easier target. And so one of the best way to protect kids is make sure that that kid has a network of adults that trust and support and are looking out for that kid. And we always say 5 because, if one of those adults that the kid trusts is actually the one who's an abuser, there should be 4 others that they can go to and say, this is a problem.
Yes.
But everybody has to respond appropriately when a child raises something, because too often, we have the kind of response that you've mentioned where kids aren't believed. And one of the things we do know is when a child first makes a disclosure, or even if an adult makes a disclosure about something that happened to them as a kid, when they tell that first person, how that person responds could determine whether or not they ever tell anyone else ever. And so we need to make sure that we're all, ask ourselves, what would we do and how would we respond if someone told this to me?
And it is appropriate at every intervention point. It seems to me that when you look at all these intervention points, starting with the school, starting with the children in the school, the teachers and the administration of the school, the caseworkers and law enforcement and the judicial system, when you put all those collaborative bodies to bear, in that way, each one of those needs to have that appropriate response that they just didn't have in the past. And somewhere it would disconnect. Like maybe it was halfway, but then somewhere it would disconnect. And people were getting away with it. I believe the stat I heard one time was something like 3% they feel as though they convict 3%. Are you familiar with
Yeah,
that?
well, I mean, because they convict 3%, but only about 6% get prosecuted, and only about 11% get reported. And so, it works its way down to that end result. And that's what we're really trying to change.
And we've really dwelled on sexual abuse. You separate that from physical abuse, other forms?
Well, all of this, sexual abuse can be the harder one because, as I said, oftentimes, it happens in secret and you don't have that physical evidence. But all of the same tools that we use to combat and prosecute sexual abuse, we use to combat and prosecute physical abuse of children as well. And that's everything, even from shaken babies is a terrible type of physical abuse that can result in death and permanent disability of infants, to how all the way to how kids are might be starved or neglected and tortured. And so we address all of these types of abuse.
Yeah, it sort of amazes me how people can do certain things to other people in the physical abuse department. The locking up in closets and things like that is, I wonder if there's a way. I mean, starting out in schools and everything is makes perfect sense, right? I wonder, and I don't know the answer to this, is how many kids there are who won't get there.
Who won't get to school.
Yeah, who won't
Right?
get
Exactly.
right.
And
Yeah.
so sometimes, a lot, some of the worst cases you see where kids don't go to school, where parents say their kids are homeschooled and they're not getting out. And because it's that, more often than not, the interaction with adults and people outside is going to be beneficial to the kids because someone is going to notice and say something's going on with this kid and ask some questions and get some intervention. And so that's really important. And one of the things that Victor Veith has always said is even in those, it makes terrible headlines. And when you have a case where there was a child who, maybe there was an active CPS investigation, but ultimately a child was killed. And Victor says, listen, nobody wanted that child to die. The CPS investigators didn't want it. The police didn't want it. But something broke down in the system that allowed that to happen, and that's what we have to identify, so that so that people have the resources, and really, if you want to protect kids, it's going to take money because you can't have a CPS worker with a caseload of 150 cases and expect that nothing's going to fall through the cracks, right? And so we've got to make sure that we have the resources available. And nobody wants to, I think for kids who are removed from the home, that's a really drastic step. It's not the first step, but again, in some cases, that's what's warranted and that's what's in the best interest of the child. So you got to keep those options open, not to overuse it, but how do we figure out and really do the analysis of when a child's at risk, what the risk factors are, what are the different types of abuse they might be suffering, and what's the best way to help that child and keep them safe.
Absolutely. And I'm glad that this has been developing now for like 30 years or 40 years. So it's coming to a point now where we actually are, I think, able to be effective in that regard. So going back to square one, though, how do you encourage people to come forward? How do you get them to do that, and to whom?
Yeah. One, you let them know they're not alone. You let them know, you help remove that stigma. And I think we're doing a much better job of that because right now, the average age for disclosure of childhood sexual abuse is late 40s, early 50s. And oftentimes, people grow up and it's when their kids or their nieces or nephews get to be the age they were when they were abused, and they look at that guy, I can't let that happen to them, and they come forward, right? But that number is coming down because we're doing a better job of talking about it. And, this used to be everyone just talked about in hush whispers. But if we can just have an open and honest conversation and not get hung up about it, then we're going to be able to identify things and make it right. And people talk about, what can I do to protect my kid? You want to know one of the most basic things that has been proven to help protect kids from sexual abuse?
Have dialogue with them.
Right. And teach them to use the anatomical names for their genitals. Penis and vagina are not a bad word, right? But
right.
If kids don't use those words, there are problems, right? First, if a kid does use the proper anatomical names, an abuser says, oh, this is a kid who's been talked to, I'm not going to risk it with this kid. This kid's going to tell somebody, right? Because there's an open dialogue. Second, if kids use colloquial names or nicknames for their genitals, other people might not know what they're talking about. There was one girl who was having problems and, kept telling her teacher that her daddy was licking her cookie, and the teacher didn't know what that meant. And so how is someone supposed to identify that? And so that's the most basic thing that you can do to help keep kids safe. And it's just the beginning. But things as simple as that make a difference in children's lives.
Yeah. Giving kids the ability to articulate, because I think one of the most difficult things, I think one of the most gripping things when I think about this are the children who are abused between those ages of 0 and 3, before they actually have a narrative, before they have, real memory and cognition and stuff. And I wonder, I have not looked into the stats on that, but I wonder if the earlier the abuse takes place, the longer it takes to sort of come to terms with it later in your life.
Well, it depends. One of the things we know is that when someone is abused that young, it is very, very difficult to prosecute someone if there's not physical evidence, right? And because the child can't articulate and can't tell what happened. When those cases are discovered, the younger the child is, and the sooner that there's an intervention, kids are pretty resilient. But the problem becomes when kids are older and don't talk, and it's been going on for a long time. An older child might be able to articulate and testify and tell what happened to them, but it's also more difficult for them to be resilient and overcome that abuse.
Yeah, it certainly would be common sense, right? Talking about the abusers for a second now, okay? I don't want to sound like I'm sympathetic towards them, but something freaky probably happened to them at some point in their lives. I mean, I think the generally accepted theory is, if an adult abuses a 7-year-old, that at some point in his or her development, it could be a female, in her development, that 7-year-old age group became the most attractive thing, and then the obsession of the sexual behavior. When you look at it in that context, is this some kind of sickness that we need a pill for? Should we be treating this in some way? I don't want to minimize it. I don't want to forget it.
We absolutely need to be treating it. And the ones that are most treatable are in fact juveniles. And sometimes juveniles who are abused will then act out and abuse other kids. And it's called, juveniles with inappropriate sexual behaviors. That's the group that is absolutely the most responsive to treatment. And we need to make sure we can't villainize those kids that are acting out. We need to get them help. And I'm all for doing whatever we need to do to try and prevent this from happening anymore. And so I absolutely believe that treatment is important. And I think there's different studies on the efficacy of treatment, but certainly treatment should be tried for everybody. Because there are so many offenders who believe that, it wasn't harmful to the child, or and that they didn't mean to hurt them, and oftentimes those are the lies they tell the child, right? Like, this is how you show someone you love them, or I'm going to show you how to be a man. And so in the off chance that they actually believe those lies, if they actually believe those lies,
the lie I hate the most is what I did to you made you the man you are today.
Right. Yeah, exactly.
Sorry. I didn't.
And it didn't have to be that way, Yeah. So.
You triggered me. Yes, indeed. Yeah. I look, both of us managed to have the level of resilience required um, to want to be here trying to do something about it. For me, it wasn't until like my 30s that I actually started to confront it. And it still gets, evolves in my head every day. Is it the same for you? Is that
Yeah, I've always said that, there is a certain arc to victimization that has a lot of moments that are both traumatic and profound. And there's certainly trauma when it first happens. But then there might be even more years later when someone realizes that what happened to them counted and they put a name on it. When people our age, when we were growing up, they were always teaching us about stranger danger, right? And because I wasn't molested by a stranger who dragged me into an alley, I thought what happened to me didn't count. And I was probably 27 when I realized that, oh, wait, what happened to me, that counted as abuse. That means I was sexually abused as a child. And there's all sorts of issues with recognizing that. And then there's others later when you recognize how you were harmed by that. And that could come years later that, oh, wait, all of this stuff is happening because of that. And that's sort of like when you get the bill. Like, okay, this is what it cost you to go through that. And so I think, there are those different times, and each one of those can be a point that sort of brings you right back to the moment that happened. But I think it's important to be able to talk about it and really give other people hope. And how do we talk about that to people in our own lives? I was speaking at a conference once as for Survivors Network of those abused by priests, and they were having their conference, and they had asked me to come speak, and it was in DC where I was living, and so it was local, and I had actually forgotten about it, but I was doing some stuff with them earlier in the day, and they're like, "And you're coming to speak tonight, right?" And I'm like, "Oh yeah, I am. Yeah, no problem." So I went to speak, but it was Friday night and I had my kids that weekend. And so the kids came along and they're like, 5 and 9, and they sit down and, my daughter who is 5 has a snack and she's just shoving chocolate in her face. My son's sitting next to me and they go to introduce me to speak, and they introduce me as an abuse survivor. And my son looks at me and says, "You are?" And I'm like, "We'll talk later." And I've got to get up and speak, right? But it's like, how do we prompt those conversations? And my son's 27 now, but when he turned 18, I told him, "Hey, I did the best I could. I know that I was probably overprotective of my kids, because when a parent's worst nightmare happened, they usually called me at work. I would take those calls to figure out how to help them. So every day I dealt with that. And so were my kids a little anxious? Was I a little overprotective? Maybe, but they're alive, they're well educated, hopefully they're well adjusted, and I feel like I did my job to protect them. But it touches every aspect of our lives. But we can't run from it, because if we keep things secret, it only helps the abusers.
absolutely, absolutely true? Now this 3-generation timeline to sort of bring this to an
Yep.
end, so I'll finally be able to go fishing in Boca. Are there steps involved in that?
Yes. And it is, and so we are, if we see each generation as being 40 years, and this was all spelled out in Victor's Law Review article called Under the Third Generation. And so we are right now about halfway through that first generation. And as I look at some of the recommendations that he made 20 years ago and where we are now, that's why I have hope for the future. Martin Luther King Jr. said, just because we can't see the top of the staircase doesn't mean we shouldn't climb those first few steps. And as I look back at the things that Victor recommended, that schools need to provide experiential education for people going into the child protection field. And we've gone in 20 years, gone from zero to having child advocacy studies in 95 colleges and universities. That's progress. When Victor 20 years ago said that every state should have a designated forensic interview training protocol, and today 37 of them do, and 23 of them use Child First, our program. And so we've gone from 0 to 37. That's progress. And so that's why I know that we can do the things that need to be done, because we've already come so far.
Money moves, I think, through legislatures.
Mm-hmm.
So do you have do you have a lobbying arm? I don't know of a nonprofit with a lobbying group.
We actually do have a lobbyist that we work with who gives us a really cut rate. And to make sure, and we do lots of meetings on the Hill to make sure that legislators and policymakers understand the importance of this, understand what we're doing and what's working. There is, the money that funds the Victims of Child Abuse Act or the Child Abuse Prevention and Training Act are all things that come through Congress that we're fighting to get reauthorized, or to make sure that there's sufficient funding to keep up with what's happening, and to make sure, because one of the problems with child abuse is that kids don't have an organized lobby. Kids don't vote, right? And so sometimes they don't get their fair share of the pie, even though it's the right investment for the long-term health of our country and our society. If we invest in kids and make sure, that they're not abused, then, we're going to have fewer people in prison or fewer people with mental health disorders later in life. And so that's, we've really got to intervene when kids are young, and to try and help legislators recognize that investment is sometimes a challenge, but it's important work, and we're committed to helping to give kids and survivors that voice. When we were working on it took many, many years to pass the New York Child Victims Act, which opened up the civil statute of limitations for child sex abuse. And in that process, at one point, we had actually commissioned a public opinion poll about the issue. And the very last question was, have you or someone you know been a victim of child sexual abuse? And you know how many people said yes? 50%. Now, some people thought that was a lot. I thought that number was low, because if 1 out of 4 girls and 1 out of 6 boys, roughly, 20 to 23% of the population has been sexually abused as a kid, everybody knows someone who's been sexually abused. They just don't know that they know someone. And when people share that and are honest about that, then all of a sudden it can start to change attitudes and help people recognize why this is so important. Because if there are 60 million men in this country who are sexually abused as kids. If they recognize that and understand that, and if they want it not to happen to anybody else, they've got to vote like it matters.
I hope that people will share this as much as they can on Facebook and other social media sites, because I think the shame, if you want to call it that, of us as a culture is that I started doing this later in life. I started in 2015. So I've been doing it for 8 years, and I just this past year found out about your organization. Like there's something so terribly wrong with the fragmentation of the way the solutions to the problems in child welfare function, and there seems to be like no central place. So I'm finding out that you do. It's so extensive and it's so close to my heart, and I'm so thrilled to have you on. And I'm just so very sorry that that's all the time we have.
That's okay. Well, thank you so much. It's been great having this conversation with you.
Honestly, I could talk to you for days. Tell folks the website. I hope they share this, but tell them the
Sure.
website.
Website is zeroabuseproject.org. And if you are a survivor, you can go to our special website, which is survivorspace.org, for lots of resources specifically for you and the people in your life.
That is absolutely fantastic. I'm just dragging it out because I was writing that last part down.
That's okay.
Absolutely. Thank you so much for being on the show. You know, I got to tell you, I usually do a segment of final words at the end, but I just couldn't. I just couldn't top what you were doing, my friend. I hope you'll come back sometime.
Oh, I'd be happy to. We can keep the conversation going.
I look forward to it. Thank you so much. I also want to thank our producer, Robin, our engineer, Ruben. Music, they told me, is provided by Mozart, but I'm not sure he was on his game tonight. Stay safe, please, everyone. Until next time, remember, it's only Monday, so there's still plenty of time to make this the best week ever. Good night, everyone.
Thanks. Good night.
Thank you. This is going to end very abruptly.